Continuing the story from the previous series begins by showing Raquel and her team finding the headquarters of the robbers. The professor accompanying Raquel looked uneasy, afraid that his crime would be exposed. Moreover, he left many things in the base that could reveal the identity of his robbery members. But unexpectedly, a few days before the arrival of the police, the professor had already cleaned the headquarters and only left the belongings of Tokyo, Rio, and Berlin. Since the identities of the three of them were already known by the police, the professor felt it would be fine if he left their belongings. As a result, Raquel and her team ended up disappointed because they could only find samples from the three people from hundreds of pieces of evidence. During that situation, Raquel is forced to ask for the help of the best forensic expert, her ex-husband, Alberto. She was even willing to put aside her ego to find something from the robbers' headquarters. At the same time, the robbers gathered to await news from the professor. Before embarking on a robbery mission, the professor had said that he would continue to request reports from Berlin every 24 hours. So if the professor hasn't contacted them for more than 24 hours, it's very likely that he has been caught, and that worries the robbers, considering it's been almost 24 hours since he hasn't contacted them. Meanwhile, the professor realized that he had to immediately contact his members. So, being very careful to avoid Raquel's suspicion, he tried to come up with an excuse. But not long after, Alberto finally arrived, and Raquel immediately introduced him to the professor and asked him to get to work. With his precision, Alberto managed to find a piece of burning paper in the chimney, making the professor afraid that he could find out his identity. Therefore, the professor quickly tried to think of a way to steal the evidence. Finally, and luckily, Raquel asked Alberto to give the professor a ride to town. At the same time, the robbers felt even more restless after seeing the professor among the crowd of policemen. Some of them thought the professor had been caught, so they had to run away immediately. But Berlin, who served as captain, asked them all to remain calm, considering that the professor still had time to contact them. Unfortunately, that still couldn't calm Tokyo down. She then suggested that they vote to determine their next move. The results were Tokyo, Rio, and Denver chose to flee, while Berlin, Moscow, Helsinki, and Nairobi decided to wait to hear news from the professor. In the end, the voting results created a conflict between them. After that, Helsinki took Oslo into the warehouse. At this moment, he feels Oslo has no hope anymore, so he decides to kill him to free Oslo from the pain. Meanwhile, the temperamental Tokyo apparently could not accept the voting results, so she asked Rio and Denver to work together to capture Berlin. Then they took Berlin into the toilet, where they tied him up with ropes. After that, Tokyo urges him to tell them about the escape plan, which only Berlin and the professor know about. The scene then switches to the professor, who is going to town with Alberto. On the way, the professor kept thinking of how to steal evidence from him. And finally, he managed to find a way and asked Alberto to stop the car, arguing that he had to pee. But in truth, the professor took the opportunity to burn the newspaper, which he would later exchange for the evidence. To do so, he purposely provoked Alberto's wrath. The provocation went smoothly. Before long, Alberto stopped his car, got out, and challenged the professor to a duel. But he lost quickly to the professor, who could knock him out without breaking a sweat. And after that, the professor rushed to exchange the evidence for the newspaper he burned. Moments later, Alberto woke up and immediately arrested the professor on charges of assaulting a police officer. The scene then moves back to Tokyo and the others, threatening Berlin by destroying his medicine to reveal the escape plan. But Berlin chose to remain silent, ignoring whatever Tokyo had to say. Berlin's silence naturally angered Tokyo even more, and she began to threaten him with a gun to his neck. Even so, Berlin remained calm. He seemed to enjoy the game she was playing. But not long after, Nairobi and Moscow finally came to Berlin's rescue, persuading Tokyo not to screw up their plans. Even so, Berlin apparently held a grudge against Tokyo after the incident. He ordered Helsinki to arrest Tokyo and tie her to the bed before Berlin pushed her out of the building, so the police outside caught her right away. The professor who was at the police station was shocked to see the news of Tokyo's arrest. However, he immediately thought of a way to get back to the headquarters and save her. On the other hand, Rio was furious over Tokyo's capture, so he rebelled, threatening to come out of the building. But Berlin certainly couldn't accept such behavior, and so he drugged Rio to prevent him from making an unnecessary fuss. Meanwhile, Tokyo is taken to the police tent for further questioning. Here, Raquel tries to persuade Tokyo, saying that her sentence will be drastically reduced if she cooperates with the police. But Tokyo refused. She trusted the professor more than the police. Incidentally, during the interrogation, Raquel gets a call from the professor who then tells her about Alberto suddenly arresting him. Hearing the shocking news, Raquel immediately rushed to the police station. But before Raquel arrived, The professor deliberately hit and injured himself so that his body was covered in bruises. Then when Raquel arrived, Professor explained to her that he had a fight with Alberto, but he did it just to defend himself. He then said Alberto started the argument and beat him until he was covered in bruises. Raquel was angry to hear that, especially when she saw the bruises on Professor's body. So she entered Alberto's room and urged him to release the professor as soon as possible. Despite his reluctance, Alberto finally frees the professor. Meanwhile, Rio came to his senses and immediately divulged all the secrets of the robbers to the hostages. However, Berlin again arrested Rio for what he had done. As the leader, he was very disappointed in Rio, whom he judged very childish. Berlin then pointed his gun at him to scare him, but they were interrupted by the telephone ringing sound, which turned out to be from the professor. Berlin had just picked up the receiver when Nairobi suddenly hit him in the head from behind and made him unconscious. Nairobi then picks up the phone and asks the professor for permission to replace Berlin, whom she considers incapable of being their captain. After returning to the police tent, Raquel orders the police to put Tokyo in jail. But to Raquel's surprise, just before she leaves, Tokyo reveals the professor's true identity, a man named Sergio Marquina. Without wasting any time, Raquel called the professor and greeted him by the name Sergio, which made him surprised. But he could still hide his expression by remaining calm as he answered her. At the same time, elsewhere, Rio was put in a special room for the hostages. Here, Arturo was again thinking about escaping, and Monica and the other hostages agreed to the idea. Rio then expressed his support for Arturo's idea without thinking any longer. He even advised them to exchange their toy guns for real weapons from the robbers. Long story short, Monica was appointed to carry out the mission of exchanging weapons, and she found that opportunity when Denver checked her feet. The next day, Raquel returns to the police tent with a plan to trap and arrest the professor using Angel as bait. First, she will spread lies about Angel having woken up from his coma, hoping that the professor will be lured into the hospital to kill Angel, considering that at this point, only he knows who the professor really is. For that, Raquel will prepare several police officers who disguise themselves as doctors and nurses so they can keep an eye on the professor's arrival. But before that, she will move Angel to another room to keep him safe. On the other hand, the professor plans to free some hostages to gain the people's sympathy. So he contacted Raquel to tell her that he was willing to release some of the hostages, but it should be broadcast live on television. A few hours later, some reporters and cameramen arrived at the Mint building where they were greeted by Berlin and the others. Berlin chose to speak in front of the camera without wearing a mask, as his identity had been exposed. The live broadcast finally started, and people all over the country watched it. Berlin acted really well in that live broadcast. He said that although they were robbers, they never harmed their hostages. Instead, the hostages who escaped earlier beat one of their comrades to death. Berlin proved this by showing Oslo's body in front of the camera while alluding to the accusation spread by the police. Furthermore, he asserted that he had never once committed an illegal practice of trafficking women, and the police had no evidence of that. Unexpectedly, all the touching stories that came out of Berlin's mouth were well received by the public. But unfortunately, they are now confused about who is right and wrong in this case. After the live broadcast was over, the professor saw the news about Angel having woken up from his coma. So Professor called Berlin and asked his opinion on the news. But Berlin had already guessed it, saying that 99% it was a trap set up by the police to catch him. But even so, the professor will still check the truth because there is still a 1% chance that the news is true, and he had to do it for the sake of their plan. So Berlin didn't stop the professor from doing what he wanted because he was sure that the professor would be able to escape all police traps. Moreover, Professor spent most of his childhood in the hospital, and he believes Professor already knows the ins and outs of the hospital. The scene then moves to Raquel, monitoring the hospital where Angel is being treated. She was sure that the professor would definitely come to check on Angel's condition. Therefore, Raquel and her team had prepared in their respective positions to capture him. But the professor is smarter than them. He posted a fake casting call at the hospital, causing a crowd of people wearing clown costumes to flood the hospital. And during the chaos, he sneaks in under the guise of a clown. While the police were busy dealing with the clowns, the professor freely entered the nursery with a stuffed bunny. Then not long after, the door to Angel's room occupied by the police suddenly opened, and they immediately pointed their guns at the door. But they were surprised to find a child standing at the doorway holding a stuffed rabbit, the same doll that the professor had brought before. It turned out that Professor had installed the doll with a hidden camera, so he could see what was inside the room. That way, now he knows what really happened. Angel still hasn't woken up from his coma. Meanwhile, Berlin and Nairobi come to Rio and inform him that the professor will save Tokyo, making him relieved knowing that Tokyo will be fine. And as if feeling guilty for betraying his friends, Rio rushed over to prevent Arturo and the other hostages from escaping. Nairobi, Berlin, and the others immediately followed behind him. Arriving in the hall, Rio and others robbers find Arturo has held Denver captive while the other hostages try to open the main door. Luckily, Rio had disabled the door opening system, so the hostages failed to make their escape. Despite this, Arturo threatens them that he will kill Denver, prompting Monica to hit him in the back to save Denver. Elsewhere, a very tired Raquel decides to ask the professor to meet at a cafe for coffee. They then meet there, and the professor gives Raquel photos of tourist destinations. But then, to her surprise, she saw a strand of orange hair on the professor's jacket that had come from the clown wig he had previously worn. And at that very moment, she realized the professor's true identity. He was none other than the mastermind behind the robbery she was after. Moreover, before Angel was involved in an accident, he had suspicions about the professor. So, therefore, Raquel tries to lure the professor to follow her to the restroom, where she catches him there. After that, she immediately took him to the headquarters to interrogate him further. Meanwhile, the robbers punish Arturo by placing a bomb on his body. So, if he dares to do something funny, they will not hesitate to blow his body up. The aftermath of the failed escape attempt didn't stop there. Berlin is now captain again and is starting to be more strict with the hostages to make them fear him. The scene returns to Raquel, who is interrogating the professor. She looks very disappointed in him, not expecting to have been lied to by someone she loves. But apparently, she wasn't the only one who felt that way. Finally, the professor admits that everything has gone according to plan, except for his feelings for her. In other words, he truly loves her. But sadly, she no longer cares about what he has to say. She was already disappointed in him. Meanwhile, Tokyo is now being taken in a police car to prison. But on the way, they were stopped by some unknown people. However, they were none other than the mercenaries sent by the professor to save Tokyo, and they managed to complete the mission with relative ease. After being released, Tokyo immediately changed into a police uniform and got the cell phone that she used to contact the professor. But since the professor is currently spending quality time with Raquel, her phone goes unanswered. So, because Tokyo does not know where to go, she finally chooses to return to her fellow robbers. Elsewhere, Raquel decides to do a polygraph test on the professor to get the truth out of him. And so, she started asking him questions, which the professor answered honestly. He admitted that the robbery he had masterminded was an idea his father had failed to implement. His father was forced to rob the printing house to pay for the professor's medical expenses. The interrogation is then interrupted after Raquel gets a call from the police, who inform her of Tokyo's escape. She was shocked and immediately asked the professor about Tokyo, and he admitted that he had sent the mercenaries to free her. Professor's confession made Raquel even angrier, to the point that she had had enough. She will hand him over to the other cops. But just as Raquel is about to lead him to the police station, the professor uses his self-defense skills to subdue her. At the same time, Tokyo had arrived in front of the money factory. As soon as they saw her arrival, Berlin, Rio, and the others immediately tried to help her by shooting at the police. As a result, a shootout occurred between the police and the robbers. At the same time, Tokyo recklessly rides her motorbike towards the building while avoiding the police's gunfire. Tokyo eventually manages to get inside the building, but Moscow gets 3 shots in the stomach at the cost of it. All his comrades immediately surrounded him, trying to give him first aid. Berlin called the police during the panic and persuaded them to send a surgeon into the building. But unfortunately, Prieto refused to send help. Instead, if they wanted to save Moscow, Prieto suggested they turn him over to the police. Berlin and the others then asked Moscow about the offer, but he flatly refused. He would rather die than end up in prison. Therefore, he asked Denver and the others to quickly dig a tunnel so they could escape from there. A few moments later, Raquel woke up and saw the professor was still beside her. She immediately took her gun and pointed it at him, telling him to come with her to the police station. But he coldly ignored her and just walked away. Raquel followed the professor outside and still pointed her gun at him. He then gave a gesture for her to shoot him, but she didn't have the heart to do it. So instead, she watched silently as the professor got into the car and left. Arriving at headquarters, the professor immediately calls Berlin, who tells him what happened to Moscow while saving Tokyo. Hearing that, the professor promised he would bring some of his men to dig a tunnel from the side of the base so that they could save Moscow's life as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Raquel, who had just arrived at the police tent, was immediately arrested. It turns out that the police have identified the professor's identity, and they accuse Raquel of secretly cooperating with him in the robbery. However, Raquel did not remain silent. Instead, she tries to defend herself, claiming that she just found out the professor was behind the robbery. and she promised to help them catch him. Inside the building, Denver, overcome with guilt for his father, did everything in his power to dig the tunnel. But he doesn't work alone. There was Monica and Rio who helped him. They believed they could complete the tunnel before Moscow's conditions worsened. Meanwhile, Raquel's position as head of the investigation is taken over by Prieto. Raquel feels she is no longer needed and decides to investigate the case alone. Prieto didn't stop her from leaving, he just asked her to hand over her gun and police badge. In contrast, she needs a badge to conduct an investigation. Therefore, she was forced to take Angel's badge. After that, Raquel immediately conducted an investigation to find the professor's hideout. She took all the CCTV footage around the cafe where they often met and then marked the streets the professor was walking on. In the end, she managed to find a place she thought was Professor's hiding place. On the other hand, Professor and the robbers are getting more and more pressed for time, as Moscow's conditions are worsened. Moreover, the police already know Professor's identity. Therefore, they had to get out before the police raided their hideout. Fortunately, after digging indefinitely, the robbers and the Professor's team outside the bank finally found that the tunnel they were digging was about to cross paths. As a result, they could now hear each other's voices from both sides. But Monica suddenly came asking Denver to meet his father at this moment. It turned out that Moscow was on the verge of death, making everyone who saw him sad, especially Denver and Tokyo. Tokyo felt guilty because she felt that she was the cause of Moscow being shot. But on the other hand, Moscow does not show sadness. On the contrary, he said he was happy to be part of their group. He even decided to give a share to Monica so she wouldn't leave Denver. Having said all that, Moscow breathed its last in Denver's embrace. His body was then put in a coffin parallel to Oslo's body. 2 people had lost their lives in the middle of the mission. But right after that incident, their escape tunnel was finally finished. The professor rushed through the tunnel to meet his members. How happy he was when he met them, although, at the same time, he was sad to lose his 2 friends. But their death was not in vain because they have managed to print money as much as 984 million euros. Admittedly, it was less than half of their initial estimate, but it was still a huge amount. However, Professor and the team couldn't stay there anymore because the police had now surrounded the Mint building. The situation became increasingly unfavorable for them, because after the professor returned to his hiding place, it turned out that Raquel was already waiting for him. Fortunately, the professor's men on the scene swiftly rescued him. However, the situation quickly turned around. Now it was the professor who held Raquel captive. But after he tied her, Angel turned out to have woken up from his coma. And the first thing he did was contact Raquel. Seeing Angel's name on Raquel's cell phone screen, the professor immediately felt anxious. He was afraid that if he freed Raquel, she would meet Angel. But Raquel tries to reassure him, saying that if she doesn't go to Angel soon, the police will interrogate him. And she was worried that if that happened, it would mess up the professor's plans. Apparently, now Raquel had started siding with the professor, and he had let her go. Meanwhile, the robbers began to be busy moving the money towards the hideout through the tunnel, and they had to do it quickly because it was only a matter of time before the police rushed in. A few moments later, Raquel finally arrived at Angel's room at the hospital and immediately told him about her worries. She no longer knows who is right and wrong, which side she should support and which side she should be against. But unfortunately, the police came to raid Angel's room to arrest Raquel at this time. At the same time, the police finally burst into the Mint building after blowing up the walls, forcing Tokyo, Rio, Denver, and Monica to try their best to repel them. A gun battle was unavoidable. Because of their cooperation, they managed to escape from the police. They then ordered the hostages to assemble so they could buy time by holding back the police. Shortly after, the police managed to find the hostages and free them. Then they continued to search for the robbers at the building. But their search was stopped after they found bombs on the walls, which the professor had deliberately set to slow them down. However, this tactic ended up not being very effective. Therefore, Berlin decided to stay behind and try to buy more time so the other robbers could escape. However, Nairobi refuses to leave him alone, forcing Helsinki to drag Nairobi into the tunnel. After the robbers left, Berlin tried his best to fight the police, and he managed to buy a fair amount of time. However, he was so persistent in his resistance that the police had to throw grenades at him to destroy his defenses. As if realizing his hopes were running low, Berlin finally asked Helsinki to blow up the tunnel as soon as possible. And after saying that, Berlin came out of his cover, getting himself shot several times. Meanwhile, at the police camp, Prieto threatens Raquel to tell him the location of the professor's hideout. In addition, he threatened her to lose custody of her daughter if she remained silent. And at the end, she told him reluctantly. Once they found the location, The police rushed to the professor's hideout and found no one there. The professor and all the robbers, and Monica, had fled only minutes before the police arrived. At the end, 1 year has passed since the world's biggest heist took place, and the whereabouts of the robbers are still unknown. At this time, Raquel, who has been fired from the police, is examining photos of tourist destinations that she previously received from the professor. Unexpectedly, the 4 photos turned out to be clues about the professor's current location. So, without further ado, she went straight to that location, Philippines. It was there that she finally reunited with the one she loved. How's the story going? Did Professor and Raquel finally make a relationship and spend their entire life together? Feel free to subscribe to our channel to get more updates about this series, and please check out our other great video. Thank you for watching.